Leave. Security's coming. Her voice wasn't quiet, it was sharp, public, meant to cut. The young receptionist didn't whisper policy, she barked judgment, her finger stabbing the air like a weapon. Heads turned. Suits paused mid-step. Phones rose. And in the center of it all stood a tall black man, calm, steady, leather briefcase at his side. He didn't flinch. He didn't plead. He just placed one hand flat on the counter, his presence larger than the command that tried to shrink him. But in that moment, nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew why silence wrapped around him like armor. To them, he looked out of place, a man mistaken for an intruder. The officer by the elevator touched his radio, eyes narrowing, waiting for the signal to move. Behind him, two junior staff leaned against the wall, one already lifting a phone to record. This wasn't just confrontation anymore. It was theater, and an audience had gathered. The receptionist's words echoed again, sharper this time. I said leave. You don't belong here. And yet he stayed. His shirt was simple, navy blue. His beard carried gray like wisdom etched into stone. There was nothing flashy about him, no badge of wealth, no sign of rank. And that was the point. He came here stripped of symbols, clothed only in dignity. What they saw was ordinary. What they didn't see was extraordinary. For him, this scene wasn't new. It was memory repeating itself. Another variation of a song he'd heard his entire life. At 20, it was a bank teller freezing his account for security. At 30, it was a hotel clerk telling him the system didn't show his name. And now, decades later, in the very building that carried his name etched into glass, the words returned again, you don't belong. But this time, he didn't need to raise his voice. The lobby air shifted. A woman waiting by the elevator whispered to her friend, "Why are they treating him like that?" A man in a tailored suit stopped scrolling his phone, sensing the tension coil tighter. The officer's hand tightened on the radio. One wrong move, one raised tone, and the script would end in handcuffs. Instead, the man drew in a slow breath and locked eyes with the receptionist. His voice came out low, deliberate, unshaken. Check my name. 4 words. Calm, but heavy enough to still the room. The receptionist smirked, mistaking restraint for weakness. She leaned forward, snapping. Don't try to play smart. People like you always try to sneak into places you don't belong. Silence stretched, thick and dangerous, the kind that comes before a storm. And here's where you, the viewer, enter this story. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now back to him. Because in less than 15 minutes, this same man accused of trespassing would remind everyone in that marble lobby of one unshakable truth. He wasn't standing in someone else's building. He was standing in his own. The lobby of Dale Innovations was designed to impress. White marble floors gleamed like frozen water. A towering wall of glass let in morning light that sliced across polished surfaces and reflected off silver-lettered logos. Everything about this place whispered wealth, precision, control. And yet, in the middle of this expensive silence, the man at the counter looked like an intruder. He wore no tailored suit, no polished shoes, just a navy polo, khaki slacks, a brown leather briefcase worn soft from years of use. To strangers, he could have been a delivery driver or a technician on the wrong floor. That was intentional. He walked in today without his entourage, without the armor of assistants or the flash of a chauffeur waiting outside. He wanted to see how his building treated a man who didn't look like money. His name was Richard Hale, 53 years old, founder, visionary, CEO, the reason this tower even existed. But not a single soul in the lobby recognized him, not yet. The receptionist only saw skin, clothing, silence, and from those pieces, she drew a conclusion. Wrong one. Behind the desk, her voice carried like a gavel. Sir, I've asked you twice. State your business or leave. Richard rested his briefcase against the counter, the brass buckle clicking softly. His eyes scanned the lobby, not in panic but in quiet observation. Every corner, every gesture was data. He noticed the way the officer's hand hovered near his holster, not for safety, but for intimidation. He noticed the way one junior analyst near the potted plant raised a phone, recording carefully, trying not to be obvious. He noticed the way 2 visitors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, sensing injustice, but saying nothing. This wasn't just a morning errand. It was a test, because Richard remembered. At 21, fresh out of school, he was denied an interview in a glass building that looked just like this one. Not because his resume wasn't good, it was stellar, but because the receptionist said, "The mailroom's downstairs." He left that day humiliated. But humiliation is a strange thing. For some, it breaks the spirit. For others, it becomes fuel. That memory still burned in him. Every acquisition, every late night, every deal that brought Dale Innovations from a two-person startup in a garage to a global powerhouse with offices across 3 continents. He carried those slights like bricks, and with them he built an empire. Now, decades later, he walked into his own headquarters dressed not as a king but as a stranger, and what happened next would decide more than one woman's career. It would expose the culture of an entire company. The receptionist leaned forward, her tone dripping condescension. "Look, you can't just wander in here. This is corporate space, not open to the public." Richard tilted his head slightly, the hint of a smile brushing his face. He'd heard those words before. Different places, different voices, same meaning, you don't belong. But he wasn't in a rush to correct her. Not yet. The officer cleared his throat, heavy and deliberate. "Ma'am, do you want me to remove him?" Her answer came too fast, too eager. "Yes. Escort him out." The marble lobby, once serene, now vibrated with tension. Phones hovered higher. Whispers swelled. A storm was forming, and Richard Hale stood at the very center, calm as ever. Because he knew something the rest of them didn't. This wasn't a mistake. This was the beginning of revelation. The decision fell like a stone. "Escort him out." The receptionist's words landed with a confidence she hadn't earned. The officer straightened, stepping forward, one hand brushing the radio clipped to his shoulder. The black cord coiled like a leash, and in this moment he believed he held the leash. Richard Hale didn't move. He stood steady, shoulders squared, briefcase still balanced against the counter. His silence wasn't fear, it was pressure. Pressure on the woman's voice. Pressure on the officer's choices. Pressure on the room that now felt smaller by the second. But silence rarely stays unchallenged. The manager appeared. Glass doors at the far end of the lobby slid open, and a man in a gray suit marched in, expression carved from arrogance. His name tag flashed briefly. "Craig Dalton, floor supervisor." He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He just took one look at Richard and declared, "Remove him now. He's trespassing." The word trespassing sliced the air. Visitors looked up. A man in a blue tie whispered to the woman beside him, "Is he serious?" She frowned, clutching her tablet closer, as though watching a rule bend too far. The officer stepped closer, his boots heavy against the marble. "Sir, you need to cooperate." His hand shifted lower, brushing the holster of his taser. Not drawn, not yet but visible. The receptionist folded her arms, emboldened by backup. "Told you, he doesn't belong here. Probably some delivery guy trying to sneak a peek inside." Richard finally turned, his gaze sweeping the room. Calm, deliberate, measuring the people who now played roles in a scene they didn't understand. The young analyst near the potted plant lowered his phone quickly, pretending not to record. A woman in a red dress at the waiting area pressed her lips tight, fingers drumming against her purse. This wasn't just inconvenience anymore. It was escalation. Craig Dalton stepped forward, his voice louder now, for the crowd as much as for Richard. "You think you can just walk into a Fortune 500 headquarters without ID? Not on my watch. Security, do your job." The officer gave a short nod, lifting his radio to his mouth. Static hissed. "Unit 4, requesting backup in the main lobby. Possible intruder." The word echoed intruder. A ripple ran through the visitors. Someone gasped. Someone else pulled out their phone. What had started as a receptionist's insult was mutating into official record, into incident, into narrative. Richard's jaw tightened, but his stance didn't break. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, almost clinical. "Run my name," Craig laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Oh, now you've got a name? Spare me. We've seen this before, smooth talk, fake stories, then gone before the cops arrive." The receptionist smirked, nodding along, her arms crossed like a judge satisfied with her verdict. And yet, Richard's eyes never left hers. "Run. My. Name." The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was fuse. A few seconds more, and something was going to ignite. The officer lowered his radio, studying Richard more closely now. For the first time, doubt flickered. But Craig snapped his fingers, desperate to keep control. Don't fall for it. He doesn't belong here. Get him out. Phones tilted higher. Fingers tapped screens. The world outside the marble walls was about to see what unfolded inside them, and still, Richard didn't move. He was a storm contained, waiting for the exact moment to break. Richard Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply stood anchored, immovable, like the marble beneath his shoes. The manager barked. The receptionist sneered. The officer hovered, but Richard's calmness swallowed their noise. The briefcase at his side wasn't clenched, it rested, steady as his hand. His breathing slow, his shoulders relaxed. For those watching, it was dissonant. They expected panic, excuses, maybe anger. What they saw instead was patience sharpened into steel. The manager, Craig Dalton, didn't like that. He mistook silence for weakness. "What? Nothing to say?" he taunted, stepping closer. "Thought so. Typical. Typical." A word meant to strip away identity, to flatten a man into a stereotype. Craig said it loud enough for the room, hoping shame would do what force hadn't. Richard blinked once, deliberately. No other movement. His restraint was louder than any rebuttal. The officer shifted uncomfortably, radio still in hand. "Sir, if you don't speak up, we'll have to assume—" Richard cut him off, not with volume but with precision. "You assume too much already." The words hung heavy, not shouted, but weighted with quiet authority. A few visitors exchanged glances. Someone whispered, "He doesn't sound like a man lost." Craig scoffed. His confidence rattled but not gone. He leaned on the counter, looming over the older man in the polo. "Let me make this simple. People like you don't stroll into corporate headquarters without clearance. Security isn't optional. Either you leave now, or we make you." Richard didn't flinch. He let the insult land, let it echo, let the lobby choke on its ugliness. Then he exhaled slowly, a man refusing to be rushed. His silence was strategy, forcing them to reveal themselves, word by ugly word. The receptionist grew restless. "Why is he still here?" she muttered, loud enough for half the lobby to hear. "Do your job already." The officer's jaw tightened, but still, he hesitated. Something about Richard's composure didn't fit the script he'd been handed. Across the room, the junior analyst who'd been filming shifted his phone slightly higher. The red light of his camera reflected faintly in the polished floor. He wasn't the only one. 3, maybe 4 devices now pointed discreetly toward the confrontation. Richard noticed, of course. He always noticed. But instead of acknowledging them, he spoke again, his voice low, unshaken. "Words are stronger than lenses. If you want to change a room, speak in it. Don't just film it." The analyst froze, caught, lowered his phone a fraction. A ripple of tension moved through the crowd because this wasn't a man begging. This was a man instructing. Craig bristled. "Enough games. Security." But Richard raised one hand, palm open, calm. It wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was a pause, a command hidden in restraint. And in that moment, the marble lobby shifted again. The noise from Craig, from the receptionist, from the officer, all of it seemed suddenly smaller. Because silence, when wielded like this, wasn't emptiness. It was dominance. Richard Hale hadn't shouted once. He hadn't moved an inch. And yet, somehow, he was already the most powerful man in the room. The lobby wasn't quiet anymore. It buzzed, not with words from Richard, but with the low hum of witnesses deciding what this moment meant. At the far corner, a young analyst, no older than 25, shifted nervously. His phone camera was still on, its red light blinking faintly against the reflection of the glass wall. He knew he wasn't supposed to film inside corporate headquarters, but he also knew he was watching something wrong. His hand trembled slightly as he whispered to himself, "This doesn't feel right." A woman in a red dress, seated near the reception area, glanced from her tablet to the confrontation. She wasn't filming, she didn't need to. Her eyes tracked every detail. The way the receptionist leaned forward like a predator marking territory. The way the manager barked orders without listening. The way the officer's hand lingered near his weapon while the man in the polo never moved. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and finally she muttered under her breath, "Why is nobody stopping this?" 2 visitors, business partners waiting for a meeting, exchanged uneasy glances. One leaned closer, whispering, "He asked them to run his name. Why don't they just do it?" The other shook his head, uneasy. "Because they don't want to know who he is." The officer's radio crackled again. Backup was on the way. That static filled the lobby like a countdown, tightening the air. Phones lifted higher, discreet, but not invisible. The hum of an audience that wasn't content to just watch, they were ready to judge. And judgment has a way of shifting power. The young analyst finally spoke, voice uncertain but loud enough to carry. Maybe we should check the system? Just verify? The receptionist shot him a glare sharp enough to freeze him in place. Stay out of this, she snapped. Do your job, not mine. Craig Dalton, the manager, smirked, eager to perform authority. That's exactly why interns shouldn't open their mouths in front of real clients. His words dripped with disdain, aimed at both Richard and the trembling analyst. The analyst looked down, shame burning his cheeks. But the phone in his hand kept recording. The silent witness he couldn't be out loud. The woman in the red dress stood now, her voice stronger than his. He hasn't done anything wrong. You're treating him like a criminal for standing in a lobby. Heads turned. For the first time, someone broke the wall of silence. Craig's jaw tightened. Ma'am, please sit down. This doesn't concern you. But it did. It concerned everyone watching. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the marble space. This is wrong. Why won't they check his name? Why escalate like this? Richard remained still, his silence deliberate. He didn't need to spark the room. The room was sparking itself. And as the officer glanced around at the growing number of witnesses, something flickered in his eyes, doubt. He wasn't sure anymore if removing this man was procedure or mistake. The radio in his hand felt heavier now, as if it carried not just policy but consequence. Craig, blind to the shift, doubled down. Enough. Security backup is on the way. We'll drag him out if we have to. But the lobby was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the watchers, the ones filming, the ones whispering, the ones now speaking out. The tide of truth had begun to rise. And Richard Hale hadn't even lifted his voice. Backup security hadn't even arrived yet, but the mood in the lobby had already curdled. Craig Dalton, the manager in his gray suit, decided patience was beneath him. He straightened his tie, puffed out his chest, and spat the words loud enough for every witness to hear. He's not a client. He's a con artist. Get him out before this building's reputation is ruined. The receptionist nodded eagerly, her smirk widening. I told you. He's pretending to be someone important. Look at him, no badge, no clearance, no appointment. She waved her hand at Richard's polo and worn briefcase like they were evidence of guilt. He doesn't belong in a place like this. The phrase, a place like this, hung in the air, poisonous. A woman by the seating area gasped quietly. Someone else muttered, She really said that? Phones lifted higher, lenses drinking in every drop of arrogance dripping from the front desk. The officer's voice hardened. Sir, they've asked you to leave. If you refuse, we'll remove you. Craig took it further. Forget removal. Lock him in the holding room until the cops get here. If he's carrying stolen documents in that briefcase, we'll know soon enough. The insult wasn't subtle anymore. It was direct, public, designed to humiliate. Richard didn't flinch. His hand still rested calmly on the counter, fingers lightly brushing the leather of his briefcase. His silence infuriated them more than any outburst could. The young analyst in the corner shook his head, whispering to himself, This isn't right. He didn't even raise his voice. His phone trembled in his hand, but he didn't lower it. The receptionist leaned across the counter, her tone dripping venom. You hear that? You're being investigated. Better confess before this gets ugly. Confess. As if standing in his own lobby was a crime. Richard inhaled once, slow and steady. His eyes scanned the room again, phones glowing, witnesses murmuring, judgment building like a storm cloud. He knew the timing. He always knew. Every insult wasn't weakening him. It was tightening the noose around the ones who thought they held power. Craig sneered again, louder this time. Why are we wasting time? He doesn't even look like he could afford parking here. Fraud, plain and simple. The words snapped like a whip. A collective murmur rippled across the lobby, shocked, angry, disbelieving. The woman in the red dress stood taller now, her voice cutting through the air. That's enough. You don't know who he is, and you don't care. You just see what you want to see. Craig's eyes narrowed. Sit down, ma'am, or you'll be escorted out too. But the crowd wasn't shrinking anymore. It was swelling, silent alliances forming with every insult hurled. Phones lifted higher, fingers hovered over record. The lobby wasn't a private space anymore. It was a stage, and the world outside was watching. Richard finally spoke, his voice calm, level, but sharper than a blade. You've called me a thief, a fraud, a trespasser, and yet you've checked nothing, not one fact, only your assumptions. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was indictment. Craig's face reddened, but he doubled down anyway. Enough riddles. Security will handle you. You're done here. The radio crackled again. Backup was seconds away. The confrontation had reached a new altitude. Every insult now carried the weight of exposure. Every word Craig uttered was another nail in his own coffin, and Richard Hale, still silent, still steady, was holding the hammer. The static of the officer's radio was still buzzing when Craig Dalton made his move. His patience snapped like brittle glass. He stepped forward, grabbed Richard's leather briefcase, and yanked it off the counter. The sound of it hitting the marble floor cracked through the lobby like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. Phones rose higher. "There," Craig barked, pointing to the fallen case as if it were evidence. "He's hiding something. Probably stolen documents. Open it. Now." The officer hesitated, but the receptionist was quick to fan the flames. "Told you! He's a fraud! That bag proves it!" She leaned into the words, savoring them like a victory. Richard didn't move to pick it up. He stood, still as stone, watching as they tried to strip him of dignity. His silence burned hotter than anger. The officer crouched, his gloved hand reaching for the latch. Before he could flip it open, Richard spoke calm, controlled, deliberate. "Touch that and you'll regret it." The warning wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The lobby stilled, air thick with the weight of it. But Craig smirked, mistaking composure for bluff. He nudged the briefcase with his polished shoe, mocking. "What's wrong? Afraid the truth will come out? Maybe it's fake IDs? Maybe it's someone else's credit lines? People like you always carry proof of lies. People like you." The phrase cut deeper than the shove. Witnesses recoiled. Someone whispered, "Did he really just say that?" A woman near the elevators shook her head, disgusted. The officer's hand hovered again over his taser, torn between orders and instinct. Craig doubled down. He snatched the briefcase from the floor, holding it up like contraband. "Look at him dressed like a courier, acting like a king. You don't belong in this building, and I'll prove it." Phones zoomed closer. The analyst whispered into his mic, "This is bad. This is really bad." The receptionist, emboldened, reached across the counter and shoved Richard's shoulder, just enough to leave, no doubt. "Out, now, before the cops drag you." That touch, a single push, shifted the lobby's air into fury. Murmurs turned sharp. A man in a navy suit muttered, "That's assault." Another raised his phone higher, voice trembling, "I'm recording this. Everyone needs to see." Richard's eyes lowered briefly to the hand that shoved him. When he looked back up, his gaze was steel. "You just crossed the line." "It wasn't a threat. It was a verdict." Craig laughed, holding the briefcase higher. "What line? You don't make the rules here." But in that moment, for the first time, his voice shook. The receptionist tried to laugh with him, but her smirk faltered when she saw the faces in the crowd. No one was smiling. They were watching silent, furious, recording. The air in the lobby wasn't corporate anymore. It was courtroom. Every word, every shove, every insult was evidence. And Richard Hale, still calm, still unshaken, was about to deliver judgment. The briefcase dangled from Craig Dalton's hand like a stolen trophy. The receptionist's shove still echoed in the marble silence. Phones hovered higher, red recording lights burning like tiny witnesses in every corner. And then Richard Hale moved, not fast, not in anger, but with precision. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped a single button. His voice was calm, almost soft, but it carried across the lobby like a command. "Activate Protocol 7. The words cut cleaner than any shout. On the other end, a crisp voice responded instantly. "Confirmed, sir. Executing now." It was his executive assistant, miles away, plugged directly into the company's backbone. Her tone wasn't surprised. It was prepared. Craig blinked, confused. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Richard didn't answer him. He didn't need to. Around the lobby, subtle changes began unfolding. The receptionist's desktop terminal flickered, its screen freezing mid-command. The officer's radio buzzed, then went silent, overridden by a stronger channel. Even the digital directory on the far wall reset, flashing Dale Innovations' crest before locking out. One by one, systems were slipping beyond their control. The analyst filming in the corner mouthed to himself, "What's happening?" His phone trembled as he caught every second. Craig forced a laugh, shaky at the edges. "Tech glitches, that's all. Don't think you can scare me with your little tricks." But his grip on the briefcase tightened. Richard's eyes met his. "You're already scared, and that's before you know who I am." The receptionist scoffed, but her monitor's frozen screen betrayed her. "Security, shut this down," she barked at the officer. But the officer hesitated, Static still hissed faintly from his radio, but the dispatch channel was gone. His calls weren't reaching anyone. He stared at the device in disbelief. That's not possible. Richard lifted the phone back to his ear. Log this moment, he said evenly. Timestamp the shove. Timestamp the word fraud. Archive every phrase. The assistant's voice was crisp, efficient. Already logged. Full transcript being compiled. Their access history is also under review. Craig's face flushed crimson. You think you can intimidate me with some phone call? You're nothing here? Richard finally took a step forward. Not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate. The kind of step that made space bend toward him instead of away. He picked up his fallen briefcase from Craig's shaking hand, brushed off the scuff where it hit the marble, and set it gently back on the counter. His voice didn't rise. It deepened. You tried to strip me of dignity. You tried to brand me a criminal. You laid hands on me. And all of it, every second, is being recorded inside the very system you serve. Gasps fluttered through the lobby. Someone whispered, "This man isn't ordinary." Another muttered, "He has control." The receptionist's smirk collapsed. Her hands hovered above the frozen keyboard, powerless. The officer lowered his radio completely. His doubt was no longer flicker, it was fire. Craig sputtered, voice cracking under pressure. This is some kind of scam. No one has that kind of reach." Richard looked at him calm, steady, absolute. Scam? No. Power. And you just handed me the proof I needed to use it. The marble lobby vibrated with silence. Phones kept rolling. Judgment was no longer coming, it was here. And Richard Hale had just begun to deliver it. The lobby stood in suspension monitors, frozen, radios dead, witnesses wide-eyed. Phones hovered like satellites, orbiting the center of gravity that was Richard Hale. Craig Dalton still clung to bravado, his voice cracking at the edges. Big words, tech glitches, but you're nothing here. Just a man in a polo trying to play king. Richard's silence stretched, heavy as granite. Then, at last, he spoke. You've mistaken me for less than I am. That's your error, and it will cost you everything. He turned slightly, lifting the phone again. His tone was calm, surgical. Patch me into the executive channel. A beat later, the assistant's voice echoed loud, deliberate, spilling from the receptionist's frozen speakers as they rebooted under his authority. Executive override engaged. Richard Hale authenticated. Gasps rippled through the lobby. The name was like a crack of thunder. The young analyst filming mouthed the words, stunned. Richard Hale? His phone wobbled as he zoomed in closer. Craig blinked, disoriented. Wait. Hale, that's impossible. But Richard didn't leave him room to breathe. He straightened, presence expanding, every inch of restraint sharpening into revelation. I am Richard Hale, founder of Dale Innovations, architect of this building. The name etched into every sheet of glass above your head is mine. The room ruptured. The woman in the red dress gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A man in the waiting area muttered, "Dear God." Phones shook as their owners realized they weren't just filming a dispute, they were filming history. The officer stepped back a full pace, color draining from his face. "Sir, I didn't know." Richard's eyes cut toward him. "You didn't need to know. You just needed to treat me with dignity. That's what you failed." The receptionist's smirk had shattered into pallor. Her fingers twitched over the dead keyboard, desperate for something to cling to. You can't be him. Look at you. You don't." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't dare. Richard's reply was quiet, merciless. "I don't fit the picture in your head. That picture was never reality. It was prejudice, dressed as policy." Craig stumbled over his words, panic edging into his arrogance. This is a stunt, a trick. You can't just claim." But before he could finish, every monitor in the lobby flickered alive at once. The company crest blazed across the screens, followed by a single line of text. Executive owner, Richard Hale. The evidence towered above them, undeniable. Guests erupted, some in shock, some in applause, some just whispering furiously into their phones. The analyst whispered into his mic, "He owns it. He actually owns it. The whole damn building." Richard turned back to Craig and the receptionist, his voice low but slicing like glass. "You tried to humiliate me in a lobby I built. You called security on the man who signs your paychecks. And now the world is watching you learn the truth." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, final, irreversible. Richard Hale had revealed who he was. And in that instant, the marble lobby didn't belong to Craig Dalton. It didn't belong to the receptionist. It didn't even belong to the officer with his radio. It belonged to Richard, as it always had. The moment the monitors lit up, the lobby cracked open. Executive owner, Richard Hale. The words glowed across every screen. Undeniable, immovable. They were verdict and revelation rolled into one. The receptionist's jaw fell slack. Her hand hovered above the useless keyboard, shaking. A minute ago, she had barked orders like a gatekeeper. Now she looked like a trespasser in her own chair. I didn't know, she stammered, voice thin as paper. Craig Dalton's face drained of color. Sweat gathered at his temple. No, this can't. His eyes darted from the glowing screens to Richard's steady gaze, as if searching for an escape hatch in a room with none. The officer who had threatened removal stepped back, his hand slipping from his holster. His radio hung dead at his side. Sir, I was only following, the words faltered. He knew excuses wouldn't save him. And then came the crowd. The young analyst whispered into his phone, excitement and disbelief tangled together. It's him. It's really him. Richard Hale, the founder. His camera shook as the feed went live to whoever was watching. The woman in the red dress didn't whisper. She raised her voice, clear and cutting. They tried to throw him out of his own company. Heads turned. Murmurs swelled. What had been quiet discomfort transformed into open outrage. Phones clicked higher. Guests shifted closer. A man in a Navy suit called out, "You owe him an apology." Another added, "This is discrimination, plain and simple." Craig's knees bent slightly, as if the floor had tilted beneath him. He looked at Richard, then at the wall of witnesses, then back again. "Mr. Hale, please. This is a misunderstanding. A mistake." His tone dripped desperation, a man clawing for ground already gone. Richard didn't respond. Silence was the punishment. The receptionist tried to salvage herself, her words trembling. We were just following protocol. We didn't mean..." But Richard's gaze cut her off. Calm, steady, unblinking. The kind of silence that exposed excuses as cowardice. The officer swallowed hard, eyes scanning the lobby as if anyone could rescue him from his own choices. None would. The guests pressed in closer now, their voices layering into one clear verdict. A young man by the elevator shouted, "We saw what you did, all of it. You can't cover this up." A woman clutching her briefcase added, "People need to see this. We're posting it everywhere." Craig's mask cracked, his shoulders slumped, arrogance leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. For the first time, his words trembled. "Mr. Hale, please." The receptionist's eyes brimmed with tears, not guilt, not yet, but fear. Fear of the consequences she could now see marching toward her. Even the officer, once rigid, now seemed smaller, his authority shriveled by exposure. The entire lobby had turned. What had begun as their stage was no longer theirs. The crowd wasn't silent anymore. They were witness, jury, audience, and every single one of them knew who held the gavel. Richard Hale didn't move. He didn't need to. The building itself had already spoken his name, and every other name in that room, the receptionist, the officer, the manager, was already collapsing under the weight of it. They weren't in control anymore. They were in free fall. The marble lobby was no longer a place of business. It was a tribunal, and Richard Hale stood as judge. He lifted his phone again, not in haste, not in anger, but with the deliberate calm of a man who had already decided. His voice was low, precise. "Carla, initiate termination protocol. Effective immediately." On the other end, his assistant's reply rang through the frozen speakers, clear as a verdict. "Confirmed. Please specify names." Richard's gaze didn't waver as he looked at each of them in turn. The receptionist still pale, trembling. The officer eyes down, shame crawling up his neck. Craig Dalton, the manager who had mocked, shoved, and stolen his briefcase, sweat dripping down his temples. "Craig Dalton, floor supervisor. Access revoked." Craig's ID badge beeped once, then glowed red. The sound echoed louder than thunder in the silence. His tablet, clipped to his belt, went dark. He reached for it in panic, tapping the dead screen with shaking fingers. Nothing. He looked up, horror dawning. "No, no, please. Mr. Hale, you don't understand." Richard's gaze was merciless. Angela Brooks, receptionist. Access revoked. The woman gasped, clutching at her badge as if holding it tighter might stop the inevitable. It buzzed, glowed red, and died in her hand. The frozen desktop in front of her blinked once before shutting down completely. She whispered, almost to herself, "Please, I didn't mean..." But the words had no weight left. Richard's eyes shifted to the officer. The man stiffened, swallowing hard. "Sir, I was only— You were complicit." Richard's tone cut through him. "Officer Ryan Mills." Access revoked. The man's radio crackled once, then went dead. His badge glowed the same condemning red. His lips parted, searching for defense, but none came. He lowered his eyes instead. The crowd erupted not in cheers, not yet, but in a low wave of astonished murmurs. Phones captured every second. Witnesses whispered to one another, "He just fired them here, in the lobby. Live." Craig staggered forward, desperation breaking what little dignity he had left. "Please, Mr. Hale. One mistake. Don't destroy my career for one mistake." Richard's silence pressed heavier than words. Then he spoke, voice ironclad. "One mistake is forgetting a name. One mistake is a typo on a form. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And choices have consequences." The words landed like a gavel. Craig sank back, defeated, his badge still glowing red, his career evaporating in front of strangers and smartphones. The receptionist covered her face with shaking hands. The officer lowered his radio to the floor like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and Richard Hale, still calm, still steady, turned slightly toward the crowd. "Their names are logged, their actions recorded. Justice doesn't need volume, it needs evidence. And now you've seen it." The lobby erupted again, louder this time. Applause mixed with gasps, anger with awe. Richard hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't moved with violence. But in a few quiet sentences, he had dismantled arrogance, stripped power from abusers, and restored balance. In the space of minutes, he had turned humiliation into justice. And justice, once delivered, could not be undone. The lobby was hushed, but it wasn't empty silence. It was charged like the air after lightning strikes. 3 badges glowed red. 3 careers ended in the span of breaths. And yet Richard Hale hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lifted a hand. The receptionist sat frozen behind her dead monitor, trembling fingers tangled in her necklace. Craig Dalton leaned against the counter, face pale, sweat streaking his temple as though the building itself had rejected him. The officer stood stiff, radio hanging limp at his side, a man stripped of the authority he thought untouchable. Around them, the witnesses moved. Phones lowered, not because the moment had ended, but because it had already been captured. The woman in the red dress looked at Richard with wide eyes, then spoke softly, reverently. "You didn't even yell once, and you still ended it." Richard turned, scanning the faces around him. Guests, employees, strangers, every one of them a witness. His voice, when it came, was low but carried to every corner of the marble space. "You all saw it. Words meant to erase me. Hands meant to push me out. Assumptions stacked higher than truth. That's the world we live in." He paused, letting the weight settle. "But you also saw this. Silence is not weakness. Calm is not surrender. Justice doesn't always need an army, it just needs evidence and the courage to act." A murmur rippled, agreement rising from strangers who only minutes ago had been passive observers. Richard reached for his briefcase, lifted it with deliberate care, and clicked it shut. The sound echoed like final punctuation. "They tried to humiliate me in a lobby I built. They called security on the man who pays their wages. But I don't need to shout or film or beg. I am the result of every slight they thought would break me. I am the proof that prejudice doesn't decide destiny." His gaze swept the lobby one last time. "Remember this. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, watches, and when the time is right, it speaks once, and everything changes." He adjusted his jacket, turned toward the glass doors, and walked with the same calm steps that had carried him in. No rush, no retreat, just steady authority leaving its mark behind. The doors slid open with a sigh. Light spilled across the marble floor, and then he was gone. But the echoes stayed. The crowd buzzed with awe, outrage, vindication. Phones uploaded. Voices rose. The story of what happened in that lobby had already escaped the building. Richard Hale didn't need to see it trend. He didn't need applause. Justice wasn't performance, it was permanence. And as the lobby's reflection returned to its polished stillness, one truth lingered sharper than all the rest. He didn't just own the building. He owned the moment.